Now today we are going to start reading one of the great books of all of Western civilization. And we're going to spend a couple of weeks doing it, which isn't enough time, but it will at least give you a first run through it. And when you look at Plato's Republic, I think the first thing that you'll understand is that it's not strictly a work on politics, though it has the title, The Republic. All in one book, you've got a theory of ethics, of politics, of economics, of psychology, of education, of religion, and most importantly of all, of philosophy. And from this book, all of those fields have been influenced during the millennia that followed. It's not even really clear that this book has got much to do with politics. Plato may be using the study of government, the study of the state, as a metaphor for truth and for human understanding and the human moral sensitivity. Because really, after all, though the subject of the book is justice, which we think of as a political word, remember the Greek word that is being discussed throughout this book is not justice, but dike. It is an inquiry into the nature of dike, that most fundamental of all Greek values, which means balance, proportion, harmony, justice, all sorts of things of that general kind. And so we're looking at an examination of a value that expresses itself in morality and everything else. And this is really a study in the Greek mind, trying to understand the Greek mind. Now, during the course of these next three lectures actually, I'm going to go through the argument pretty much step by step, picking out what I think are some of the crucial turning points, the points on which you have to make up your mind. Because in a way, this is an argument. This is the laying out of a position about the nature of reality and about what follows from the nature of reality insofar as it concerns human conduct. And it's one that's going to influence your thinking in various ways, but it's a very radical point of view. In fact, the fame of Plato is not really that he represents our common sense at all, because he doesn't, or that he's represented the common sense of any era. Plato has never been accepted as the official philosopher of any time. Plato has always been the countervailing force, the underground philosopher, the philosopher that causes us to think differently about what we take to be common sense. And not just in our age, but in all ages, he's pretty much played that role. So the question that you're going to have to ask yourself as we go along is, how far do you accept this argument? And when you do not accept it, when do you reject it, and why do you reject it? What reasons do you give? Now, the way we'll proceed is that today we'll pretty much work through the way the Republic is written, from the beginning through the creation of the ideal state, the state of the guardians. And then next time, which really runs in our edition of the book from pages 1 to 178, and then next time we'll just focus in on the allegory of the cave, which runs from 179 to 235. Now, those of you who are listening at home on the radio might want to follow along with our reading of Plato's Republic. This is a book that you can get, I'm sure, from your local library. And as I say, during our first session, we'll be working through the argument all the way to the end of the creation of Plato's ideal constitution, and then next time through what will be called in any edition of the book, the allegory of the cave. Now, let's talk a bit about Plato and Socrates, because as you've already discovered, though this book is written by Plato, Socrates does all the talking, and he is the main protagonist. And Socrates was Plato's teacher. And we don't really know today whether whether Plato was actually recalling or trying to record things that Socrates actually said, or whether he was dramatizing the Socratic method. We do know that he meant this to honor his teacher. We don't know how much then, and we never will know, how much of this is Plato's thought, how much of it is Socrates' thought, because the two are mixed together. The method, we believe, is Socrates' method, and a lot of it is his philosophy. But some of the political overtones are Plato's. Let me just say a word about the era in which this was written. We talked about the golden age of Greece, when Athens felt this tremendous sense of creativity and pride. And we associate this literature, Plato and Aristotle, with the golden age of Greece, but really it comes after the decline of Athens. Because in the golden age, the golden age came to a period of what we might call ebullient or almost jingoistic nationalism. Athens, feeling its power, feeling its success in throwing back the Persians, feeling its creativity, became in its most democratic period an expansionist power. It set up colonies, it tried to lead the Peloponnesian Wars and a number of wars, and finally, very much like the United States perhaps, moving between the era of, let us say, the Second World War and Vietnam, it overextended itself, and at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, say about 404 BC, it began to suffer military reverse after military reverse. Its armies, its navies were defeated at sea. The country became quarrelsome, internally doubtful, skeptical of the expansionist democratic currents that had led it to this kind of a conclusion, and eventually its democratic constitution was replaced by a much more oligarchical rule. Some called it a tyrannical rule. Well, there was a period, the period of the 30 Tyrants, that then succeeded upon the democratic constitution about 400 BC. And this was replaced by little junta after junta, small dictatorial group after small dictatorial group, until about 399, 397 BC, when, in fact, the democratic constitution was restored. Now, Plato and Socrates apparently had many misgivings about democratic Athens in the Golden Age. And both of them had more or less supported the regime of the 30 Tyrants on the following grounds. They felt that democratic Athens had become too much a government of popular opinion rather than a government of law. That the courts were just proceeding whimsically to apply law any way they wanted to do, that the country was moving from one overseas expedition to another, very much at the whim of the strongest voice and the demands and the expectations of the masses. They were, even though masses in this case only connotes 30,000 people, the middle class seemed to be seeking things that the country could not do and ruling in what they felt was an inconsistent, arbitrary, and unlawful way. One day the law would be this, the next day the law would be that. The courts did not apply the law consistently from one case to another. Rather, they decided on the whim of the moment. And for this reason, Plato and Socrates had grave doubts about the democratic regime. Now, when the democratic constitution was restored, in fact, the leaders of that administration sought out Socrates and put him on trial on the grounds both that he had corrupted the youth, had been asking embarrassing questions, had questioned the gods of the country. This is a popular movement of the people, movement that felt Socrates was unpatriotic for doing these things, and because of his collaboration with the regime of the 30 Tyrants. And in the famous trial of Socrates, which appeared before a court of some 500 people, the question was asked whether he had in fact been a traitor to the country. And the decision of the court was that he indeed had. Now, the prosecution in the case asked that Socrates be put to death. The defense asked that he be let off with a small fine. The court was a very divided opinion as to what to do, and they really hoped that Socrates would choose exile because it would be very embarrassing to put him to death. Now, what succeeded from that is a scene that's been recorded in all of Western history, which is that Socrates in prison, awaiting execution, the court has passed judgment on him, is in fact given the opportunity to escape, to go into exile. And his friends and the accomplices of the regime give him ample opportunity to choose exactly that course and thus to get away. And in a long series of deliberations, Socrates reflects on the reasons he will not choose exile over death. And they have to do with his particular understanding of the law and of the polis. And here we see most evidently this peculiarly Greek sense that politics is the center of the master science, as Aristotle will later put it, and the center of all human concerns. Because for Socrates, to be outside of the polis was not to be capable of life at all. Living in the polis creates life. It gives a person a personality, it gives you your character, it gives you your morality, it gives you your law. In this sense, politics creates culture. And to live outside the polis is something that a person can't do. Now, if one is a citizen and has determined and is morally committed to uphold the laws, you can't do that just at your own convenience. And so when the time comes when you are given a chance to disobey the law, it would be inconsistent and immoral to take that opportunity. So Socrates chooses not to go into exile. He chooses the route of his own death, in a sense, to make the case, in effect, that consistency with one's moral commitment to the law is not a matter of convenience, but must be something that one endorses throughout and consistently throughout life, and that one just breaks faith with reality, breaks faith with the nature and the order of the universe in doing otherwise. Now, Socrates plays a particular role in the Greek philosophy that we've talked about so far. He is one of those who quest after that which is real and permanent behind appearances, and so he belongs to the legacy of Greek science. But in a way, he breaks from the tradition of Greek science, because Greek science thought that the most important thing to look for was what was real about the material universe, in what we would today call the realm of the natural and physical sciences. So those who sought the basic element of matter were going one way. Now, Socrates felt, and here he was really quite closely allied with his antagonists, the sophists, that the real crux of the question lay not in what was real about matter, but what was real about the human mind. You recall, the sophists had argued that what we thought was real about matter or the universe or the world did depend on the theories we created. And since they had come to the conclusion that all truth was a product of the human mind, and that we could only know truth insofar as the human mind reflected reality. But Socrates' position was a little bit different, in that he felt that truth already existed in the human mind. We were just not groping to comprehend things that the idea of mathematical form, the image by which we measured all things, the form that gave us our sense for what objects were, was already latent in the mind. And then that one brought this out and exposed it through a process of inquiry. Hence, the Socratic dialogue or Socratic dialectic, this process of asking questions by which we clarify our very approximate thoughts, becomes his technique of knowledge. And it's a very crucial technique. It works tremendously. David Nixon, Alan French will try it on you from time to time. You may want to try it on each other. It gives you the chance, if you just keep asking why, just keep probing, eventually you'll find out that the thought behind your thought might have been very far from what you originally expected or what you thought in the first place. And Socrates, throughout the Republic, you see this ongoing scene, almost to the point of tedium, where Socrates keeps asking questions and people give their sometimes stupid answers. Finally, about halfway through, Socrates reduces them to utter boredom, and they just keep saying, yes, Socrates, over and over again. But the thing begins on a very promising note. Now, this method was Socrates' way of drawing out of the mind something that was already there, something that he was in search of. And this is the form behind the thing. And this idea that behind everything in the world there is an ideal form, else we could not understand it, is very essential to the whole Platonic notion of truth. In fact, it was the central Platonic teaching. So that things are not just what we see them to be. The things of this world are imperfect realizations of something that's more ideal. Now, the way we usually teach this is to say, all right, to see a horse out there in the pasture and to recognize that it is a horse. I mean, how did you know it's a horse? Why didn't you call it an albatross? Why didn't you call it a window frame? You know, why didn't you call it Brother George or something like that? Why did you call it a horse? Well, for you to see it as a horse, you would have to already have in your mind, so the argument goes, an image of a horse. Yea, an ideal of a horse, the very idea of a perfect horse. And when you look at that horse, you say, well, that's a good horse or a bad horse. Or that's not quite the same horse as the horse I saw the other day. And so you begin to realize that the horses that you see in the world are imperfect approximations of some ideal. Now, in the Platonic sense of things, everything we recognize as a distinct idea or a distinct object has behind it that eternal and immutable form. We can talk about horses. We can talk about the ideal table. But now let's get, but talking about more serious things, we can talk about the ideal person. Again, when you use the word a human being, and you look at one of your friends and you say, that's a human being, or you look at yourself, and I say, well, is that a perfect human being? You'd say, well, not really. Now, how did you know to do that? How is it possible? And where is this human being, this model by which you're measuring other humans and saying, no, if I'm not really perfect. I wish I had this right and this right and this right with me. And even if that was all right, I wouldn't still be perfect. Or how about these other characteristics of your friend? And you say, no, those aren't quite what I mean. Is that person that, I say to you now, is this person that you've just met, is that what you really mean by being truly human? And you'd say, no, that's an example of a human being, but it's not what I mean by truly human. Now, how'd you do that, is the question. Where did you get this idea of a perfect human being? Was it something you read in a book? I rather doubt it. You'd have to show me the book, and I doubt that you could think of it. Well, the Platonic idea is that that model, that image, is in the mind, and that's what enables you to think about not only what distinguishes a human being from other species, but it enables you to make gradations, comparisons, to think about the arete, the excellence of being human, the virtue of being human. And you create a sense of arete, or virtue, by measuring the ideal that is in your mind against the person. Well, we can do the same thing with ideas. You say, gee, that's a beautiful sunset. Now, how'd you do that? How is that possible for you to say, have you ever seen an ugly sunset? But what do you mean by beautiful? Against what are you comparing it? Unless the idea of, now this gets harder, unless the idea of beauty itself is already in your mind. How would you know it was beautiful? How would you distinguish the beauty of a sunset from the beauty of the back wall of a handball court? Unless you were capable of some kind of discrimination between those things that had to do with some ideal type. Or take the word justice. Now, we've already explored that in one little example. Before you have a theory of justice, before you can say rationally what's just and unjust, you have what Edmund Kant used to call a sense of injustice. You may not know what justice is, but I think you know what injustice is, that which doesn't make the form, that which doesn't meet the standard. As I said before, if I did something terribly arbitrary, like assigning this half of the class a paper and that class not, and you asked me why, and I said, well, these people don't look as good as the other people. Something's wrong there. You'd feel very uncomfortable at that idea, and you'd call it unfair, even before you had a theory of what unfairness is. Now, once again, how did you do that? How did you know that was unfair? Nobody has taught you a complete theory of justice. You haven't learned it from your culture. This is something the Platonists argue that comes from within. So the whole Socratic dialogue is at the one level meant to bring out this sense for the form, this sense of clarity that's already in the mind, one. And the whole of the Republic is an inquiry into the form of justice. So let's see how it begins and take it step by step through its various stages. Now, as you begin reading it, you see what's happening. We're at a party. It's one of those late night bull sessions that happened in Athens among the leisured class. We are going to debate philosophy. We've come away from a festival. If you want a Wisconsin equivalent, what we're doing is going to the country tavern, for a few beers. And we're going to sit down, we're going to have a good talk. And it'll work out about the same way. And really, it's not such a distant analogy if you know Wisconsin country taverns, because you can have some pretty good talks there. The only thing that's missing is Socrates, some of the time, not all of the time. But it depends on the country taverns you hang out in. Okay, so now let's just kind of think about this. This is the scene, this is the setting, and you can just feel in the beginning of the book that kind of fascination. And we're going to sit down for one of the longest bull sessions in recorded history. By the time 280 pages go by and we have discussed all of knowledge, it must be 4 or 5 days later, and you can just tell how weary people are getting by the end of the conversation. Socrates keeps picking up, as you notice, toward the end. He gets to say everything at the beginning. The other folks are getting their innings in, and as I say, about 4 o'clock in the morning of the third day after this thing begins, you can just hear them say, "Yes, Socrates, will you please shut up, Socrates?" But not Socrates. He just keeps right on going there until he reaches the end of the book or the end of your patience, whichever comes first. But it starts in kind of a high note, and they begin talking about the question, what is justice? Just, kind of thing you'd pick up in the afternoon. And various people come forward, and their definitions of justice may not strike you as important at the beginning, but they are reflections of the sort of thing that the man on the street or in the country tavern would say. For example, the first person to offer a definition of justice is Cephalus. And he comes up and says, "Okay, I'll give you a definition. I'll start this thing going. Justice means telling the truth and keeping your promises." Now that sounds pretty superficial to you, I suppose, at first glance, because you're already ready for philosophy. When you think about that, that's pretty profound. We can condense a lot of morality into those two propositions, telling the truth and keeping your promises. The whole basis of contract law is essentially based on that, which is the binding cement of our society. And if you say, what is morality, in essence, what should a good person do? To tell the truth, to keep your promises, not to deceive people, not to try to cheat them, not to try to harm them, is really the basis of a businessman's ethic. And it's the basis of any commercial civilization. And it's also the basis of any society that rests on the premise that the real legitimate relations between people are voluntary and contractual ones. So if we don't deceive each other, and if we do what others expect them to do in terms of the contracts we've made, so classic liberalism would tell us, we have perhaps the essential moral foundations for a good society. In our society, we might argue, for example, that if you didn't break the laws that you've, in effect, agreed to through democratic process, that's promise keeping. If you kept your part of the bargain in commercial transactions, that's promise keeping. If you did not intend to deceive others or to cheat them, that's truth telling. That we could run a pretty workable, viable social order. The classic liberal of the Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan variety might say that this is indeed the essence of morality. Now, why does Socrates find it inadequate? Well, he begins to question Cephalus. He says, well, are there not some occasions where telling truth is wrong, where you'd simply call it wrong? For example, if somebody asked you, if one of your friends asked you, this isn't Cephalus's example, but sometimes we can try better ones here. Somebody asked you, tell you what you think about me. Tell you what you really think about me. Now, are you going to tell that person the whole truth? Are you really going to harm that person's ego? Are you really going to, in a sense, destroy their own sense of their own self-worth if you have some doubts about them by letting them in on everything you know? No. Something holds you back and tells you it would be wrong to tell them the whole truth. So the truth-telling in this sense does not constitute a sure or complete guide to morality. The same with keeping your promises. So Socrates uses the example of borrowing a weapon from somebody, and then the person goes kind of insane, and thinks that they might, thinks that you think that they might harm themselves if you gave it back, so you keep it. So you haven't kept your promise to return the weapon. Now, in both cases, I suppose you could say there's an overriding principle that you should not harm others, that really willfully, meaningfully, that overrides the principles of truth-telling and promise-keeping. But at this point, all that Socrates wants to drive home is really a more fundamental point, which is, wait a minute. If you can take a given rule, a rule that you can articulate, like tell the truth, keep your promises, and if you can, under questioning, say, well, gee, under these, you can say, well, I don't know now. You say, this may not be always true. It may be wrong. It may be unjust to tell the truth in some situations. Then two very important things follow. One, that you are measuring the standard itself against still a higher standard. There is something in your mind that is telling you how to test whether the rule itself that you have taken to be the rule to judge your actions is right or wrong. And the second thing is, you're no longer a cultural relativist if you buy this argument. That the only thing you know about morality, the only thing you know about law, the only thing you know about goodness and badness is what your culture has taught you. Because this rule, tell the truth, keep your promises, is an old rule in our culture, as it was in Greek culture. And in a way, you've all been carefully taught that since the cradle. And in a way, what Plato is suggesting is, cultural relativism, the culture as the source of morality for its own convenience, for its own internal perfection and maintenance, that's not all there is to it. You, the individual, are capable of judging the rules of your culture because of the sense of justice within. So right here, you've got to ask yourself, am I going the rest of the way with Plato? Because right here, you can change your mind and say, now, wait a minute. But in fact, right here, only about 10 pages into the Republic, you've got a choice that you have to face up to this semester, which is either you're going to go along with Plato on this one and Socrates, or you're going to go along with cultural anthropology, and you can't have it both ways. Either you're going to lie to your anthropology teacher, or you're going to lie to Socrates, but you cannot reconcile the two. I mean, either morality is the product of culture, in which case you cannot make judgments because of something else, or Plato's and Socrates are on the right track so far. So you're deciding between Socrates and Cephalus right from this very moment. Now, second move in the argument. If you've gone that far, and you're still willing to go along, and you're not willing to say, no, Cephalus has it right, what morality really means is simply what these rules that are handed down to us, and to ask what they really mean is a futile and an illogical undertaking. That the essence of morality is to do what our fathers taught us to do, to honor our traditional values. You can say that and not inquire into them. You can say this, and then you are not accepting the Socratic method of proceeding. Now, Polemachus follows the similar line in his second argument. He's the second person who gets up and proposes a theory of justice. And essentially what his conception of justice boils down to is, again, a rule, almost a cliche. To Jew, justice is to help your friends and harm your enemies. Now that sounds a little distant to our ears. It's a cliche, it's a bromide. It's very much, but it was a conventional saying in Athens. Just the same way if you asked somebody who really hadn't thought much about the matter what morality was, they'd say, well, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They would just sort of quote something that they'd heard was the essence of morality. And what Socrates is going to do with this saying is about what George Bernard Shaw did with the Golden Rule, which was to say, do not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The others may not have the same tastes, thereby destroying the whole idea of the Golden Rule. And in this sense, what Socrates is doing is challenging people to think deeply about what we might call conventional, inherited, traditional beliefs, to see if they really hold up under scrutiny. Now, he follows a number of lines in arguing this point. One of them is to simply say, well, Really, do we really mean that it's always good to help friends and harm enemies, or is that really just a morality for wartime? Does that cover all the branches of morality? Or is this really only applicable to a very special kind of situation, the nation in its foreign relations, basically? For example, he would say, would we say a doctor was good if he harmed his enemies? Would we say that a person, and besides, a person might mistake who is his enemy. Would we say it is good to harm an innocent person just because you thought that person was your enemy? Now here again, what Socrates is doing is saying, if you can see the point of those questions and say, well, there may be something wrong with the rule, I would not say it is good for a doctor to harm his enemies. You may be saying, I am measuring in my mind goodness and badness of rules themselves, rules that are supposed to give me a sense of goodness and badness, against something else, against an image of, or a sensitivity, if you want to use that word, to what justice is and what justice is not. Now, the third protagonist, Thrasymachus. Justice here becomes the interest of the stronger. And Thrasymachus argues that what we mean by, and he comes on, tough-minded, burly, absolutely on top of the situation. And he's going to argue that what we mean by justice can only be discerned, well, that justice doesn't exist. He knows what Socrates' game is, and he's going to tell you what justice is. Justice is the interest of the stronger party. What justice really turns out to be is what the people in charge want us to do. And we learn this, and it's almost a Marxist argument. Justice is what's in the interest of the ruling class. That's what it really boils down to. Don't give me all this stuff about good and bad, right and wrong. When we talk about the idea that private property is a good thing, what it really means in America is that we've been taught to respect private property, and the reason we've been taught to respect private property is that that serves the interest of the capitalist class. So really, when you talk about what we mean by right and wrong, good and bad, it's what is useful for those who rule us to have us believe. So that all morality is a rationalization. It's a kind of myth that's foisted upon us to keep us organized and manipulable by those who are in power. Now, it may not be the ruling class. It may be the majority. But it doesn't matter. The stronger element determines what justice is. And, and that's that. Now, a lot of you are tempted by this position. If you think about it long enough, you may work yourselves into believing it. What's Socrates' response to it? Well, it seems an evasion at first. He simply argues, well, what would happen? Is it not possible for the stronger element or the ruling class to mistake their interest? They might tell you, for example, that it was good to go to war and get you all whipped up in a patriotic fury to harm your enemies, and you might lose the war and they might be destroyed in the process. Now, would it be, if you really mean that justice is the interest of the stronger, then following the stronger when they mistake their interest would be a mistake, wouldn't it be? Well, Thrasymachus thinks about this and he begins to think, well, maybe I've got a little bit of a problem of a contradiction there. But what Socrates is after again is, wait a minute, if you can go that far, you once again can say the individual can measure, can judge the authenticity even of things that have been learned, that have been created by the whole mythology that's been created by a ruling class. For example, if you took the Thrasymachus position that justice is simply the will of the stronger, you might come to the conclusion that, well, justice means doing the job that your teacher or your employer told you to do. But if in the middle of the job you look up and say, now wait a minute, if I do this, the company's going to go bankrupt, what are you supposed to do? You've got your orders, you've been told what to do, you can go ahead and do it and the company's going to go bankrupt. Or you can say, now wait a minute, your object can't be that the company go bankrupt. You can make an independent judgment of the point and the purpose of the activity by yourself, apart from anything you've been taught. And if you do that, you're judging by a standard that is apart from what you've been taught or what has been willed by the stronger party. Now, all of these refutations of simple tests of justice lead Plato, or Socrates, to another consideration which is just absolutely crucial. And this is the one that I think the whole book turns on this point. If you get by this one, if Socrates can suck you in on this one, you've got to buy the whole rest of it, I think. If you can refute it, then maybe you can resist his argument. And that is the question of whether government is to be regarded as like a craft, like medicine or navigation or architecture. Now, here we're building to a notion of what political justice is. And as Socrates argues, the point of a craft is certainly not the advantage of the craftsman. We would not say ever in any language, any ordinary sensible conversation, that the whole point of medicine is to make doctors richer. Now, the doctors may look at it that way, but we would say that's a corruption of medicine. I mean, Victor Borge tells the story. I have an uncle. He's a doctor. He specializes in the diseases of the rich. And everybody laughs. Now, why do you laugh? Well, partly because it's a whole perversion of the point of medicine. We measure medicine by its purpose, which is to create health. And we know that its object isn't to further the fortunes of those who pursue it. Well, Socrates argues then, the same is true of any craft. The object of carpentry is, of course, to secure a living for the carpenter, but that's not its real point. Its real point is to build houses. The object of navigation is to sail ships from here to there. And so we can inquire about the point or the objective or the end of any craft and find out what its real function is. Now, that poses the question of what the end of an end. A craftsman, then, is one who knows the end of the trade and how to get there. Now, here we're discussing virtue, excellence, arete. To be a skilled navigator is to know the excellence or the virtue inherent in navigation. To be a skilled doctor is to know the excellence, the virtue, the arete inherent in medicine. It's not to know how to make money. It's not to know how to expand its practice. It's how to heal people, for goodness sake. So this poses the question, is government a craft? And if it is, what is its end? What is its excellence? What is its virtue? But there's more to this than meets the eye, isn't there? Because if we say that government is like a craft, then we're saying there's some who are going to be good at it and others who are not. And that means that those who are naturally fitted to govern should govern, and not just anybody. The same way you wouldn't want medical practice to be done by the lottery system, the way we select juries. Who's going to treat your broken back? We'll take the first 10 names out of the phone book and see who's available. You want it done that way? Okay, maybe so. I don't know. I don't think so. Take airline piloting. Should we do that by lot? Take the 20th passenger flies the plane. No, I don't think you want to do that way. Now, the argument you see here is that democracy starts with the assumption that all are equally fitted to rule. That's what Pericles had in mind. Democracy starts with the assumption that each person's vote counts the same as every other person's. And what Plato is suggesting is possibly democracy rests on a false assumption. Everything depends on whether you accept the analogy between other crafts and government. Because if there is a skill, if there is an excellence, if there is a virtue to governing, then those who govern should have that virtue and none other. Now this theme, of course, leads, well, there's another question in here. There's a dialogue with Glaucon. Suddenly somebody jumps into the conversation and at this point tries to turn the tables on Socrates, says, you've been asking all the questions, let me ask you a question. Why is justice itself a good thing? Most people don't really want justice. They really just want the reputation that comes with justice. They don't want to be good, they want to appear to be good. You think about it, and he says, now you've got to prove to me that it is really good to pursue goodness in and of itself and for itself. And Glaucon's argument is, I'm not persuaded of that. I'm persuaded I can be a very happy person if I pretend to be good. If I do the nice thing, if I'm nice to my teachers, if I study carefully in school, if I do all these things, not because they're good, but simply because I know I'll get a good job and then I can move to suburbia and live a yuppie lifestyle and restore an old house and drive a Mercedes-Benz if I do all those things. But that's really good. And don't ask me about, getting good grades in school because of the intrinsic joy of learning or anything like that. Come on now, that's not it. So prove to me that it's worth pursuing justice and not all these other things I'd really think most people want and that they would call good in and of themselves. Now, that puts the burden on Socrates to make his positive case. Enough asking questions, Socrates. The ball is now in your court. And he does this, he says, he's going to examine then justice, which he takes to be the aim of government. The skill, the art of government is creating dike, creating harmony, proportion, balance in the world. And he's going to examine that at two levels, he suggests. One, we can understand what justice is in itself as a moral question, what the good life is, what the good for the individual is, by looking at it this way. But we can also understand political judgment, justice, because they're the same thing. They're one and the same thing. And the reason we can do this together is that essentially by blowing it up and talking about it in political terms, instead of in terms of the individual and morality, talking about politics instead of ethics, what we're doing is looking at justice in the large. The state and its nature provides us with a larger scale on which to view the question of what justice is itself. But also in that way, we will get to the question is, if we took seriously the proposition that governing is a craft, what kind of a state would we then create and describe as legitimate? And on this basis, Plato begins to describe his famous utopia, which, by the way, looks very much like the constitution of ancient Sparta. Now, the first proposition is an economic one, and is the foundation, incidentally, historically, of free enterprise economics, if you want to look at it that way, modern capitalist economics, which is that the proper foundation of the state is a division of labor, by which Socrates means that not everyone should do the same job, that it is appropriate for different people to do different things. You don't want Marx's utopia that we'll read about next semester, in which everybody does manual work and everybody does poetry and everybody does the variety of jobs. You want people to specialize. Now, why? Well, fundamentally, and here's the theory of human nature underlying Plato, people are different. People are not created equal. People are created with different excellences, different talents, different abilities. And it is adikia, it is unjust, to ask a superb carpenter to be a university professor or vice versa. It is unjust to ask somebody who's all thumbs to be an auto mechanic, and it's unjust to ask somebody who's tone deaf to be a musician. You want human occupations sorted out in terms of human abilities. Now, at this point, you say, yes, Socrates, of course. And so he goes on and describes the principle of an economy that's differentiated and in which society will only be well-governed and will only be harmonious and in balance if people are doing the things they're suited for. Now, this is not only an image of society, it's a standard of judgment. We can say that something's wrong with society if people are doing things that they're ill-suited for. And in a sense, we can always criticize an existing social order when people are doing things that they are not suited for. Now, from this it follows that there are many different kinds of trades, many different kinds of skills. But when we look at the skills of government, we are going to need some specialists themselves. And he speaks of specialists in war, soldiers who have certain kinds of virtues, and he discusses their virtues, the police, and the administration, and he talks about the different qualities, the different human qualities that would go into those skills. But as he goes along, he begins to say, but none of these really are the specialists in government itself. I mean, war is a subdivision of government. Carrying out administration, even justice, is in the sense of running a court, is a subdivision of administration. When we come to the rulers, when we come to those who are to make the laws, the supreme legislators, they've got to be someone else. They can't just be calling out the functions, they have to be creating justice. And so they are people who cannot simply be reflecting, notice, custom, tradition, what's been going on in society. They have to rise above it. So these, the guardian class, have to be set apart from birth and placed in a special education and a special system in society, a governing class that will then be prepared to carry out the craft of governing, to carry out the craft of administration. Now, since excellence at statecraft has to do with balance, harmony, and proportion, as you read, you find that the education of the guardians will be that of learning all those things that reflect justice in its various forms. They will learn architecture, they will learn art, they will learn music. Why? Because in all these ways you're reflecting different kinds of justice. So you have to go at learning this idea of justice indirectly. So the guardians are taught by seeing the manifestations of justice in all different parts and forms and ways and activities of life, because you can't just tell them what justice is. The forms cannot be taught directly. We see only its reflections, parts of it, in diverse human activities. We note that the life of the guardians must be communistic, communal. They do not have they are deprived of private property. They are deprived of family. They live together, and the reason for this, of course, is that they must be impartial and disinterested. They must follow the aims of statecraft. They must follow the aims of justice, which are not their own aims. Because just as medicine is corrupted if the doctor follows his own wishes or the wishes of his family rather than the wishes of his craft, so the state is corrupted if the governors follow the wishes of their family, their self-interests, are concerned with those things, rather than with the wishes of, rather than the pursuit of justice for its own sake. Very similar to the principle of Catholic celibacy, that the Catholic prelate should be free from all concern for anything but service to God. Well, there follow many other things, but as you look at this, toward the end, you begin to see what Plato's ideal society looks like. And your first impression, and the impression that has come down to us through all the years, is that this is a totalitarian state. Obviously, the guardians rule. They rule through administrative officers, police, warriors, who are picked for their skills. In effect, the position of everybody in society is assigned because the object is to create perfect harmony and justice. It is not Athenian democracy. It is Sparta in a certain sense. There is a ruling class on top. But if you agree to the idea that politics is like a craft, can you escape the conclusion that politics ought to be organized in this authoritarian or totalitarian fashion by those who know the craft of government?